Hi, everyone, and welcome to this edition of Judgment Day. I'm Lorne Honickman. Well, late last week, you may have heard the news that Canadian Michael Savor was found guilty in China of something they called over there espionage and sentenced to 11 years in prison. Of course, nobody knows exactly what he was convicted of, but he was convicted right around the time that Chinese business executive Meng Wanzhou out in Vancouver was facing extradition to the US. Indeed, her extradition hearing coming to a close with final submissions. Coincidental? Probably not. Another Canadian, Mr. Schellenberg, sentenced to life in prison in China for something that he said he didn't do. So let's talk about all of this right now, because it is very important. We can't get into the politics, of course, but let's get into the legalities, and especially what's happening with Meng Wanzhou and that extradition hearing. We talked about it early when we first started doing these Judgment Day webcasts and podcasts with our good friend Michael Shapray out in Vancouver. Michael, welcome once again to Judgment Day.
Hi, Lorne. How are you doing?
Good.
Thanks for having me on again.
It's a pleasure. And we said we'd bring you back when things were starting to wrap up. So we'll get to the extradition hearing in a moment. But you, like me, I guess we can say all lawyers, maybe all Canadians, have to be very, I'll put this in quotes, Michael, interested into how Mr. Savor, first of all, gets convicted of something called espionage over there.
Yeah, I mean, this is something that would raise the eyebrows of any lawyer in any democratic society who's practiced in our court system. And obviously, each country has a different court system. But for a gentleman to be convicted in a 2-hour trial in China and sentenced to 11 years in jail, where there's all sorts of speculation about a political connection to the case going on in British Columbia, and no answers. And while some people may sit there and speculate, well, they must have something, all it would take would be some evidence or any open court proceeding to demonstrate that there was some foundation for this. And despite international calls for his release or for information about the case and how the trial was conducted and the evidence that they utilized, the Chinese government has been scant in providing any details of all about what their allegations were based on.
Yeah, and we don't even know what, was there legal submissions? Was there a defense? We don't know anything. And of course, that verdict happens, about 24 hours after another court upholds, I said life sentence. I got to correct myself. It was a death sentence against Robert Schellenberg when he was convicted of, I think it was drug smuggling.
Yeah, I mean, I think we should come back to the Schellenberg case. He had a sentence that was a jail sentence, and it was changed in January 2019 to a death sentence, and that was also upheld. And there's some interesting legal issues there. That was upheld right before this extradition hearing heated up again in British Columbia. And of course, with Savor, and I've seen you in court, you can't even introduce yourself in the first 2 hours of a case, let alone have a whole trial take place. So, it's really fascinating that could be the foundation for a foreign citizen to be convicted and sentenced to a multi-year jail sentence.
And of course, there's another Canadian, Michael Kovrig, who's also charged with espionage. He's waiting. And the interesting part, Mike, I mean, there were so many people who reacted and properly reacted immediately. The United States Embassy in Beijing, they condemned the sentencing, understandably. And it's so everybody understands the context here. It's the United States, of course, that has initiated the entire proceedings against Meng Wanzhou, the extradition proceedings. And they came out and they said, I think the quote was, they're using human beings as bargaining leverage. And just to say that, just saying those words and thinking about that in 2021, it's almost unbelievable to think about.
Yeah, and that's what we're dealing with in our current, geopolitical climate around the world, and with China and the power that they're exercising, and obviously a successful company like Huawei and what appears to be at least a significant allegation the United States government is pursuing through extradition through normal legal channels and mutual legal assistance treaties and extradition treaties between Canada and the United States. There's nothing unusual about the process involving Meng in BC, and the judge is going to make a decision on that. It's an open court hearing. It's through traditional extradition channels. But this idea that two Canadians get plucked off the streets of China within days of her arrest and now have been essentially utilized, and their court process has dovetailed with some of the proceedings here, raises unbelievable questions. And I think there's about 23 countries around the world who have stepped in and at least proclaimed that there is an issue here that needs to be addressed, and requiring China to respond, to which there's been silence.
Yeah. All right. So let's talk about how it dovetails into this proceeding, where we are now at final submissions. And I think what we need to do, Michael, just so people understand, because we may forget about that, these subtle legal aspects. This is an extradition hearing. I think everybody understands what we mean by extradition. Meng Wanzhou is wanted in the United States, specifically New York State, on charges of fraud. Okay. So what is the legal issues and the legal basis when somebody's facing extradition between Canada and the US? What was this entire hearing about? What was a judge deciding here?
We've had a number of preliminary proceedings, but the extradition hearing itself, which is taking place last week and this week, is about the request by the United States, who are known as the requesting state. They make an application to Canadian authorities to extradite someone who is present in Canada and facing an allegation or a charge in their country. As you said, in this case, New York State, looking to prosecute her for an allegation of fraud. The extradition treaties between the countries allow that to happen, and they have to present a record of the case. It's not a trial. The judge is not entitled to challenge all the evidence and dig deeply into it and start to draw significant inferences from the evidence. And it must be an offense that exists in Canadian law. So in this case, we're talking about fraud. Fraud is a broad range type of offense where there's all sorts of different elements to it and ways that it can be proven. And the United States has presented their case in a record of proceedings to the Canadian court through Canadian lawyers who represent them in the hearing. And they're looking to meet the test, which isn't particularly stringent, as to whether or not a Canadian court could convict someone of that offense based on this record of the proceedings. And that's really what the judge's role is to do this week as we get to the actual hearing. There have been a number of, go ahead.
Sorry, no, I was going to say, what you said is the test isn't that high.
No.
And meaning that what the requesting state, i.e. the US, has to show is that this charge of fraud is a charge that's recognized in Canadian law, correct?
Recognized in Canadian law, which it is, and that there's some evidence by which a trier of fact, a jury or a judge, could convict someone. And the test is similar to anybody who knows about Canadian law and preliminary inquiries. The test to get over a preliminary inquiry is very low. There's got to be some evidence, not a prima facie case, not a strong case, not an overwhelming case, and not proof beyond a reasonable doubt. The judge has to be satisfied that there's some evidence of an offense in Canadian law that the requesting state has presented.
All right, so let's talk then. We heard the Crown submissions, and I guess given what you just said, there's no surprise that Robert Frater, who's acting for the requesting state, I said the Crown, acting for the requesting state, basically told the court, if I understand his detailed submissions last week, that there's no new legal ground being instituted here. This is simply a fraud case about, and I'm going to give the quote that I wrote here, a case about lying to a bank in order to get a banking service continuing to flow as before. It's not unusual.
Right. And that's it. So the requesting state's lawyers, who are Canadian federal prosecutors, have said, look, there's nothing unique about this case. This is a fraud case. There doesn't have to be an actual loss. There's been a risk of loss to the bank based on misrepresentation about Huawei's involvement with an equipment maker doing business with Iran.
Right.
The unique part is these U.S. statutes about doing business with Iran, which isn't what you would see in a normal bank fraud, for instance, where someone goes in with false information or other stuff to try and get a loan or whatever they may be doing. So the requesting state saying, look, there's nothing unique. It's a fraud allegation. There's evidence of misrepresentation to the bank. Send her to New York State to face her charges. And that's the general position that was presented over two and a half days last week in the court in Vancouver.
Right. Because if I understand what her lawyers, and we'll get more specifically to their submissions, but what Mr. Frater was trying to argue, if I understand it, is that this is not unique. This is not unprecedented. And there's nothing about the case that puts it into that category.
Right. Now, prior to the actual extradition hearing starting last week, the defense brought an application for an abuse of process, right, and essentially asking for it to be thrown out. We don't have a ruling on that. And one of the things the defense is saying is that aspects that led up to the extradition hearing, the arrest of Miss Meng at the airport and questioning of her, comments made by the United States president at the time, Mr. Trump, and the destruction of some notes that may, or the non-taking of certain notes, all amounted to something unique about the process or the procedure that led us here, as opposed to whether or not there's a fraud allegation and the evidence is there. So there's that preliminary argument that's been made. I assume we're going to hear a decision on that at the same time as we hear a decision on the actual extradition. And we're starting day 2, probably as we speak, in a Vancouver courtroom, of defense arguments expected to last over the next few days as to why the judge should reject the requesting state's application for extradition on the basis of the extradition law, and not this abuse of process application.
Well, and because what they argued on Friday, Michael, was that they said that the case was, I guess, again, to use their words, riddled with evidentiary gaps. It doesn't even meet the threshold for extradition, just as you were saying, and that basically the charges that are being presented against her fail to make clearly exactly how anything she did even amounts to fraud.
Yeah, and that's what they have to argue. They have to argue there's not some evidence by which a judge or a jury could convict her of a fraud allegation. Looking at this limited body of evidence called the record of proceedings that the requesting state submitted. And they're going to try and say that through a technical analysis of what's been presented, that the judge can't draw any inferences or can't go very far in that regard, and that they haven't even made out a case on the basic test for an extradition.
Interesting. You know, when we think back, Michael, this all started back in December 2018. That's when she was arrested at the airport out where you are in Vancouver, and all taking place with the Michaels in China, etc. And when you think about this, whatever happens here, let's assume she's ordered to be extradited. There will be, I would guess, an immediate notice of appeal filed, and these things can start winding their way to the Supreme Court of Canada before anything happens with it.
You have a person facing extradition with what appears to be unlimited resources. There is a team of lawyers that spans from British Columbia to Ontario that are representing her here. Apparently, the British Columbia lawyers weren't sufficient enough, so they brought in a number of lawyers from Ontario on this team, and the resources are unlimited. And I would expect that we'll see, if she's ordered to be extradited, appeals filed, applications to the minister. I could see this case being dragged out for a number of years if there's an order for her to be extradited. At the end of the day, ultimately, most people who are sought to be extradited out of Canada are actually extradited. It's an overwhelming percentage. I think I've read, maybe over 90% of people who are sought to be extradited get extradited. But people with unlimited resources could drag out that process and chisel away at it for years to come.
Yeah, and what will that mean? You know, to use your words before, geopolitical. We've started an election campaign in this country. Will this become part of that? And how all of these factual and legal arguments taking place in the courtroom out where you are, and whether the judge in this case, how long she's going to take to make a judgment. It's quite incredible that there are so many different parts to this puzzle, if you will. And all we want, of course, as lawyers, as you'd agree, when we're looking at a case like this, is just make sure that everything is done where there is nothing political about it.
Well, and what's interesting, and we of course believe in our justice system, our politicians are coming out and critiquing the Chinese justice system. We can only assume that the Chinese people have some belief in their own justice system. Their politicians are challenging our justice system. And, but of course, our own politicians are staying out of the fray as to what's going on in the courtroom. And I don't know that that can be said for what's going on in China, because there's certainly been state officials and other people who've commented on those proceedings in China as well. But it is very interesting. We're all independent countries, but our politicians have chosen where they want to make comments and what they want to comment about. Though for the most part, the politicians haven't commented on what's going on in the British Columbia court, the Canadian politicians, that is.
And what really sort of is so fascinating about all of this, or one of the many things to me anyway, is, as you said, the important words, the requesting state. The genesis of this was the United States. The genesis of this wasn't Canada. So one would assume, if we played this this conspiracy card any further, that one would ask, well, why didn't China detain a U.S. citizen or two U.S. citizens? Because what's Canada supposed to do? Say to the United States, well, we have this treaty, this is what we're supposed to do, but we're not going to do it? I mean,
it's fascinating. Canada's doing what they're required to do based on their relationship legally with the United States. The reaction from China, if these cases can be found to be linked, is against Canada, but Canada has the authority in their court system to make the decision. There doesn't appear to be any retributive steps taken by China against the US to say, hey, withdraw your request for extradition.
Right.
And
Right.
I haven't seen people really writing or speaking about that issue.
Nobody.
And that's really quite fascinating. It's the Americans who requested her. This process is going on because of the Americans pursuing it. The Canadian judge and the Canadian system is just doing what it's required to do with the Americans. Why are Canadian citizens the target of the ire of the Chinese government when they could focus on the United States?
Yeah, and that has puzzled me from the beginning. And indeed, if the theories are correct, if all of the theories are correct, that whatever's happened to the Michaels and Mr. Schellenberg somehow is related to a request by the United States and Canada doing what it was supposed to and is supposed to do, then why these steps? It's never made sense to me. But again, all I'm sort of, I guess, I'll use the word happy. I mean, or at least content is a better word to use, that at least it appears what's been going on in your city, in that courtroom throughout this entire proceeding has been done according to the rule of law. And it appears that's how it was working and working now.
Yeah, we have to have faith in the system. We have to believe in the integrity of the system, and that a senior judge hearing this case will make legal decisions. But you're making legal, I mean, a judge is just a human being. They're making legal decisions that have international, political, geopolitical consequences. And that's got to be a lot of pressure for any judge sitting in a case and lying in bed at night thinking about writing a decision that's going to be critiqued by somebody.
That's right. Oh, yeah, 100%. All right, Michael, thank you so much for the update. And we, of course, will check in after the submissions, and who knows how long Her Honor will take to make the decision. But it will be obviously once we get anything. it will be looked at with very important scrutiny.
Yeah, we expect the case will wrap up this week, and I would expect it'll be at least a couple months before we see any decision.
All right, Michael, thanks so much.
Thanks for having me. Take care.
Okay, we'll talk to you soon.
Bye-bye.
Michael Shapray, lawyer out in Vancouver, following closely the extradition of, you know, this executive. I mean, and it's this, I mean, you can just keep looking at so many different parts of this case where you look at it and you say, you know, this is you know, Meng Wanzhou, she's an executive with a high profile company. Under normal conditions, we wouldn't be dealing with all of these other issues, these side issues. But as Michael and I were saying, what has always been to me one of the most puzzling and troubling parts of all the theories of what's going on, and I'm not saying that the theories aren't correct. I'm not saying that what appears to be out there is not actually happening, but I've always wondered, as we talked about there, why is the ire not against the requesting state? And why, if indeed there are these ramifications for Canadian citizens, it's because Canada has only been doing what it is legally obligated to do in a very important extradition treaty with our neighbors south of the border. I don't know, maybe one day we will get all of those answers, but right now, that hearing is into its final submissions, and we will wait, of course, and watch and see what happens. All right, that is this edition of Judgment Day. Thank you again, everyone, for joining me. Until next time, I'll talk to you soon.